Hey everybody, Robert with RC Archery. You are watching Tuesday's Tip of the Week number 122. In this week's video, I'm going to give you 3 tips that have helped me over time being able to execute my shots and aim better on target while I'm doing it when I use a hinge release. Also will help you be able to use a hinge release a little bit easier and more consistently for you as well. In the members video this week, I'm going to give you some thoughts behind my shot execution when I use a hinge release, a breakthrough that I had on just making my life a lot easier when I was using a hinge release and being able to shoot and execute shots with it consistently. So if you don't know, I primarily shoot a hinge release about 99% of the time and have for years. I've dabbled with thumb buttons. I'm consistent with them in short spells, never in long spells, and I always end up back at a hinge because it just shoots my natural shot style a little bit better. And that's what we're gonna go over in this video today. All right, the first thing that helped me be able to shoot a hinge release easier and not mess up my aim was understanding how the natural balance point of the hinge works and where I wanted my personal balance to start and end with my shot execution. So let me break that down and go over what that means to me and explain that to you. So when you have a hinge release, all of them are built a little different. So you have to find out your release and what you're working with. This one is a true ball HBC. This one is pretty even amongst the finger beds here. The second and third finger is slightly higher than the index, but like on the fulcrum flex that I use a lot as well, the second finger on that fulcrum is much higher than the index. That's helping you impart rotation on the hinge release. Another thing that you can look at that will change how the balance points feel is the location of the hook. This hook on this release is pretty much square in the middle of my index and middle finger. If you have one that is closer to the index finger, the rotation of the release will happen a little faster and more aggressive. If you have one closer to the middle finger or over the middle finger, it will happen a little less aggressively and a little slower. So that is all things to keep in mind. So when I talk about natural balance point, I'm talking about getting to full draw, and you can balance the weight between all of your fingers and the release will naturally move to a certain point and then it just stops at that movement. When we are shooting a hinge release, if we balance this release out to have it stop that movement here before we start our execution, we're going to then have to impart extra movement, either by curling the fingers and getting into the release, or really pulling and rotating our elbow back or rotating our wrist, or we're going to have to impart some type of movement into that release. There is cases where people need this. They need that movement. They need to be able to get to their balance point at anchor and not have the release move itself. Typically, when I see that, that archer could be going through some target panic, or they may just not be as natural feeling with the hinge because they're used to shooting thumb releases or resistance releases, and they like that natural pressure there. It's not one or the other that's better, but that's usually what I see. Now, the flip side of that is being really rigid and tense with our index finger and drawing this release like this with no pressure on these outer fingers and it barely moving and having a lot of movement left when we get to anchor and start working through our shot. I personally don't think that is good either. I actually think that's probably more detrimental to your sight picture for most people than the first option we talked about. And the reason that it is because typically when that's happening, your hand, your finger, and everything is so tense that it's hard to work against that tension in the index. It won't release. You hang up on the release, your shot execution is really slow. You also see a lot of shake and bobble in the sight picture. I personally get about, honestly, probably about 80 to 90% of the natural rotation out of my release when I get to anchor at full draw. And then I've got about that 10, 15-ish percent that I'm actually allowing it to still rotate and work through. For me personally, that's the balance that I like. Everybody's going to be different. What that matters for you in your shot execution is feeling tension in the index and partnering that with just the overall shakiness or steadiness of your sight picture. If you're noticing you've got a lot of shake and a lot of unsteadiness in your sight picture, you have to do a lot of extra movements, you have too much pressure on the index. If something like that is going on, you're on one of those far directions, that is something to look at. Slow the release down if you have too much tension on your index. Allow it to be a little bit easier for you. And honestly, my personal recommendation When you get a hinge release and you first start setting it up, don't use it on the bow, use it on a string trainer, and set the release so stinking cold that it's pretty much just not going to fire, and just get used to feeling the balance of pressure even itself out on all your fingers, and then slowly start to increase the speed of the release, make it a little faster, until as you get to that balance point that you're used to getting to, that release starts firing before you get totally balanced out. From there, you can take it over to your bow, and then you can start fine tuning with your aim, your shot timing, how you feel with your hand, and some other things that we're going to talk about in this video to be able to get you the steadiness and the feel that you like at full draw based on how much input you want to put into the release and that you need to put into the release. All right, the next thing we want to talk about is how we're drawing the bow back to make the hinge release easier to use during execution. A lot of the times what I see with people is they're worried about the release firing because they haven't set it up like we talked about at the end of the last segment here. And there's a lot of tension in the hand, the index, the forearm, and they're drawing the bow back incorrectly and using a lot of arm muscle to draw that bow back. If we're doing that and we get to full draw, it is not impossible, but it's very, very hard to allow that hinge release to actually rotate and let it work for you. You're gonna have to put a lot of rotation into it. You're gonna have to release that pressure on the index. It's gonna disrupt what you're seeing on your float and your sight picture. It's gonna cause you a lot of problems. So what we wanna do is make sure when we're drawing the bow back that our release arm's elbow gets high enough up to impart leverage and direct the muscles that are majority of what it's being used to draw the bow back into our back muscles. So we're using that shoulder and our back more than we're using our bicep, our forearm, and our hand. And honestly, for me, when I'm drawing the bow back, I actually try to keep my fingers relatively relaxed and try to keep a lot of the tension out of my hand and forearm. There is some there, but I try to use that as a checkpoint in my shot routine to keep it a little bit more relaxed, because that forces me to make sure that I'm using my back muscles, pulling my scapula around towards my spine, getting that shoulder around and drawing the bow correctly. When you draw the bow in this manner, you load those back muscles from the very beginning. And as you get into anchor, you can relax the top of the shoulders, relax the forearm and hand a little bit more, let that hold you back at full draw, kind of focus on compressing the shoulder blade into, in towards the spine, making that like a little bit of a compression in the muscle, and using that to hold you at full draw more than our arm or hand and all of that. If we don't draw the bow back with the muscles being engaged from the very beginning of the draw motion, you will never be able to transfer enough of the weight to the back and use those muscles at full draw. So if you're drawing with your hand coming down or doing anything weird, you'll never be able to transfer that load to your back correctly, and you will still be using too much of your hand and too much of your forearm. All right, now the last one that we're going to talk about here is a big one, and it's a lot more simplistic than what people make it out to be, but it's one that we've all struggled with, myself included, and it becomes a checkpoint in my shot routine to keep it from happening as much as possible. When you're using a hinge release, a lot of the times you'll hear people say their shot is hanging up, they can't get the release to fire, they can't get the movement to happen, something is going on, their sight picture is shakier, lots of things like that you'll start hearing from people. All of that, for 99% of your issue and your problem, is in your index finger. It's having too much tension, too much of that index being curled and heavy in the release. And because of that, as you start your shot execution, whether you pull through the release, whether you're relaxing the index finger, whether you're rotating it with, your fingers adding pressure or switching pressure from your index to your middle, however you're using a hinge release, if you're not relaxed enough on the index finger when we start our shot execution, you'll see it directly downrange in your sight picture being shaky and unsteady. And you will also see that your shot timing is hugely inconsistent and that release is very hard to fire. A lot of people have this problem in a tournament too, because they get a little bit extra tense in their muscles. And that is why I build that into my shot routine. When I draw the bow back, I want my hand to be relaxed to a certain degree to be able to get the bow back to full draw. And I relax that hand a slight bit more with the index and the back of my hand and everything relaxing, transferring that weight to my back to allow the release to click. And when I anchor, that relaxation, that movement to get into anchor, that's my click happening on my release. It is a checkpoint for me to keep from having that tension in there, especially if I'm not thinking about it because too much is going on in my brain under pressure. And then from that point, your shot routine, whatever you're doing to make that release fire, all of that will be a lot simpler for you and easy. But that is the one thing, probably the most important thing out of all of these that make it just a whole lot easier to execute that release consistently, is making sure that we're not too tense on the index finger. Going back to the beginning of this video on how we talked about using a string trainer, getting the balance point of the release to where you feel that without it going off, without you worrying about it going off, maybe even transferring it over to the bow before you get it fast enough to start transferring that that speed to where you can't transfer all of the balance point out of the bow, or out of the release rather. Lots of words there, sorry guys. But anyways, that would be the 3 routines and the tips that I have for you. It'll make your archery a lot easier. It'll make it a lot simpler for you to shoot your bow, whether you're using your hinge or whether you're using a totally different style of release here. This is a spike release, so it has no moving parts at all. But you have to be able to have that rotation built up and have to have your index finger be able to be relaxed enough to have give without you having to relax it or impart some pressure there. And I know that's a popular one. I know there's another, highly popular coach that talks about relaxing his index finger, but that's really kind of an advanced technique where you have to understand what you're doing with it first, because if you start relaxing that index too much, you'll creep off the back wall. If you're having too much range of motion to relax that index finger, you can have some problems. So for the majority of people, when I teach them and when I'm doing it myself, if we can take the index finger more out of the equation, it just makes the ease of using a release a lot better, and it makes it a lot more consistent for us. So thank you for watching this video today. If you're still listening to me ramble at this point, comment down below archery vision. Thank you all again. I'll see you soon.